we've seen in many different sectors of our economy, whether it's been film and television writers, film and television actors, the potential for a big strike with the UPS Teamsters union that was narrowly avoided this week. And now we're looking at the potential for a strike from the United Auto Workers if they're not able to strike a deal instead with the big three automakers. How may that affect our local economy? I would guess quite majorly. Let's get the answer on that from Dr. Michael Greiner, Associate Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Dr. Greiner, thank you for being with us today.
It's great to be back, Tyler and Diane. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you as well. I mean, you've heard of the Summer of George. Now get ready for the Summer of Strikes. That's what many are calling this summer, as we've seen Hollywood go on strike. We've seen almost this week UPS Teamsters go on strike. That was narrowly avoided by a negotiation and a deal that ultimately was struck earlier on this week on Tuesday. But still, some strikes looming over us that could affect our economy. Let's begin with what happened with the UPS and the Teamsters, because that would have been a massive strike that would have affected the whole American economy and quite severely too. So that deal being struck on Tuesday, just days before that August 1st deadline that would ultimately start the strike, just how big of a crisis did we narrowly avoid here?
Oh, it would have been a huge crisis. You know, we have to remember our economy now is so much more based on shipping and online orders than it was just a few years ago. You know, one of the really telling things about this is watching the increase of the size of UPS. You know, back last time that they struck, which would have been back in 1997, they only had about 185,000 employees, which sounds like a lot and is. But compared to now, where they're about 330,000 employees, it just shows you how much growth there's been in this category. And even just 5 years ago, last time that there was a contract up, you were looking at about 250,000 employees. So there's just been this huge increase in the use of UPS and shippers as a result of the whole online economy that's going on. And UPS, of course, is a big player in that. I mean, they ship, according to a number of measures, about 25% of the packages in the country. And you know, looking back in the big picture here, you know, a lot of what caused the problems that we've got right now with inflation and that type of thing, that goes back to issues with the supply chain, as we've talked about before on this show. And you can imagine how much damage would have been caused to the supply chain if suddenly the biggest shipper in the country, and really, in some respects, the irreplaceable one. I mean, who could step in and take UPS's place? There really isn't anybody who can. And so that would have had a huge impact on the economy overall. And certainly, I think it would have had a huge impact here in the Metro Detroit area as a result of the large manufacturing presence we've got, and particularly with smaller businesses, the shipping that they do relies so much on UPS. This would have been devastating.
Yeah, that stopwatch countdown stopping just 6 days before the deadline to strike a deal had ultimately been made, with a deal between UPS and the Teamsters union being met on Tuesday, a tentative deal in place in that regard. But closer to home, the big three automakers still driving the economy in southeast Michigan, throughout the state of Michigan, certainly here in Oakland County playing a big role. That could potentially be another big strike that would have a hard hit here in Oakland County in particular and the state of Michigan, but would also have lingering effects across the U.S. economy. Give us the latest on where we're at in terms of the UAW's negotiations with Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, and how this potential for a strike could affect our local area.
Yeah, you know, this is interesting. And I think actually, in some respects, the UPS settlement should really be a cautionary note for the big three, because, you know, they're just in their very early stages of negotiations right now. They just had kind of the ceremonial opening of negotiations, I believe, last week. So they're still very early on in their process right now. But the new president, Sean Fain of the UAW, has been sending messages that he wants to take a much harder line with the big three than had been taken in the past, because he feels that the unions really have given up a lot, and they have, you know, let's face it, to help the big three survive and thrive through the financial crisis a few years ago, and then through the COVID recession. So he feels, and I think that there are a lot of union workers who feel right now, that they deserve to be compensated for the sacrifices that they've made. And what's more is you can see in some of the reports recently that the big three are doing amazingly well. I mean, GM and Stellantis just announced historic revenue figures and historic profit figures. And obviously, those things are the types of things that then the UAW is going to take the table and say, wait a minute, we deserve our piece of this, especially because the fact you never would have been here had we not made the sacrifices early on. And what's more, is a couple of the sacrifices that have been made by the UAW workers really kind of mirror what you saw happen in the UPS negotiations, and are exactly the type of thing that nearly led to a strike with UPS. For example, one of the things that was included in the last contract from 5 years ago for UPS was the creation of a second tier of worker. Essentially, what UPS wanted to do, because of the fact that there was more and more shipping going on the weekends, is UPS wanted to have more flexibility in how they would be able to bring in workers to be able to work on the weekend. So their idea was, maybe if we could get a second tier of workers who we can pay slightly less to, and then they can do sorting on some days, and then on the weekends they can do trucking, then that would be something that would benefit everybody. The union agreed to that. And I think it's worth noting, by the way, that 5 years ago, when the last time that UPS had and the Teamsters were in negotiations, the union had actually voted down the contract. But as a result of certain provisions in their union constitution, the Teamsters were essentially able to impose this contract upon the workers, despite the fact that a majority of the workers voted against it. So that was something that really kind of stuck in the craw of a lot of the workers, and probably was behind the fact that 97% of them voted to authorize a strike this time. So there was definitely a risk of strike. So anyway, so you've got this second tier of workers, and what UPS ended up doing, rather than kind of shifting them back and forth between driving on the weekends and sorting during the week, is UPS just used them basically as a lower tier of driver, where they could be drivers and paid less than the full-time drivers that UPS has, who earn, I believe, in the last contract about $42 an hour, and under the new contract will earn $49 an hour. So they're paid very well, obviously, thanks to the good negotiating of the Teamsters. But you can see where UPS was saying, hey, we want to have this other class of worker we can pay less to do the same job. Well, under the UPS deal, that's been eliminated. Okay. Now, the same issue exists with the UAW, because you have to remember, back in the crisis during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the UAW agreed to a lower tier of worker, where new workers would come in and be paid less than the current workers. In some cases, substantially less, like half the pay of the current workers. Well, now, obviously, as more of the older workers have retired, and the union and GM has been hiring more of the kind of the lower tier workers as they've hired newer workers, more and more of the union now comprises these lower tier workers. And they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want this lower tier anymore. Everybody should be paid the same. Everybody should be paid at the higher rate. And given the fact that this was a sticking point that literally almost led to a strike with UPS, I think should really give the big three pause right now.
And part of these negotiations that is different from what we've seen in the past, even back as recently as 2019, is that the United Auto Workers Union, as well as the Big Three, are both pledging more transparency in these negotiations, especially as the clock started this week or a couple weeks back, and is going all the way through 11:59 p.m. on September 14th. That's roughly 7 weeks of these negotiations, putting more information out about some of their bargaining points from both ends, so that everyone involved has a better idea of what's going on in those negotiating rooms. And that's not something that's all too common, unfortunately, in these labor negotiations, where you're seeing the unions and these different companies both putting all their cards on the table so everybody has an informed decision, and it's not necessarily so much of an all for one and one for all.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that this is something that's changing, which I think is a good thing. But I think it's reflective, again, of this sense among a lot of the union workers that we need to have more of a democratic movement within the small d democratic movement within the unions, where everybody needs to kind of have their voice heard. And again, something that really informs this. And I think this is where, again, there's this kind of connection between the UPS negotiations, the Big Three negotiations, is the 5 years ago when the union imposed this deal on the workers that had been rejected by the workers, not unanimously, but by a majority vote. There was this sense that, oh my gosh, the union is no longer representing the interests of the workers. And that sense has kind of gone through the labor movement overall. And I can tell you that now there's more and more pressure for the leadership of the unions to represent the workers. And one way they can do that is to keep the workers informed as to what's going on in the negotiations. And I can tell you, as you know, at Oakland University, the faculty ended up striking at the beginning of the last academic year. And during that process, we had a similar situation where both sides had our websites where we were updating everybody on what's going on in the negotiations. And so I think looking forward, you're going to see much more of that, because there is this sense now that we can't, and we see it throughout the United States right now, where we can't just kind of rely on our leaders to take care of us. We want more transparency. We want essentially people being able to provide their input into the small d democratic process some more. And we're certainly seeing that within unions. And I think that's only going to be something that increases as we go forward.
And we're joined by Dr. Michael Greiner from Oakland University's School of Business Administration, talking about negotiations that are now underway between the United Auto Workers Union as well as the Big Three automakers, GM, Ford, as well as Stellantis, now through September 14th at 11:59 p.m. That's their negotiating period to strike a deal in this case and avoid a worker strike. Earlier on in the summer, Josh Idelson from Bloomberg had mentioned, the summer of strikes and all these different strikes that are ongoing, and had noted that a Bank of America analyst put the odds of a United Auto Workers strike at more than 90%. Now, a lot of time has gone by since that report was put out, since that analyst made that prediction in this case, that estimation in this case. And given how these other strike negotiations, particularly UPS, has gone, what are analysts saying right now about the potential for a strike or the potential for a deal between the UAW and the Big Three?
Well, I think there's definitely this sense that if there's anywhere that a strike could happen, it's there. And, overall, I think if you look at the United States right now, public opinion has shifted. People aren't viewing the whole situation where the relationship between unions and employers. There was this sense that, things had shifted too far in the direction of unions, and so we need to shift back towards employers. Well, I think now that that perception among most Americans has shifted, and most Americans feel that unions are really the ones who are kind of getting the short end of the stick, and we need to kind of shift the advantage back toward workers a little bit more. So we're operating with an environment now where I think people are much more supportive of workers and much more supportive of unions. And despite the fact that still you're talking about a relatively small percentage of private employers who are unionized, overall, the economy, people are looking at unions much more favorably than they once did. So that creates an opening then for unions to be able to strike without worrying about this huge backlash against them from the public, which they used to worry about in the past. What's more, too, is that you also have currently in Washington an administration where President Biden has emphasized the fact that he views himself as one of the most pro-union presidents in history. Well, like with the UPS strike, the Teamsters had sent a message to the administration saying, "Don't get involved in our strike. We want to be able to deal with this on our own without the government getting involved and ending it prematurely." They felt that that's what happened with the rail strike. As you may recall, we talked about that back when this was happening, where the administration basically stepped in and averted a rail strike, which would have been crippling to our economy back then. So, so the sense is that they need the administration to back off, and it appears that they had gotten a commitment to that. So that's part of what put UPS in a situation that they had to settle, or they were going to be dealing with a strike. And I think you're dealing with a similar situation with the UAW right now, where you have a new president who's made it very clear that he wants to deliver a good contract for his employees. You have a this two-tier structure among employees, which has shifted and create a situation where now you've got this large group of employees demanding that they be treated the same as the higher paid employees. You have the businesses that are doing extremely well. So it certainly creates kind of this worst case scenario as far as the businesses are concerned, with the unions being in a position to strike. So I think that generally speaking, there is this view it's highly likely. That said, I can tell you that when you're right up against the strike deadline, there's incredible pressure to be able to settle. And we saw this obviously with UPS, where at the last minute they were able to strike a deal. And that's really when people get serious. You know, before you're at the strike deadline, you know, it's easy to kind of posture and make suggestions which aren't necessarily going to get accepted. But as you get closer and closer to the strike deadline, that's really when the rubber hits the road and you have to get serious about negotiations. So I think it's probably too early to say that that a strike is likely, because a lot can happen at the last minute, as we saw with UPS. But that being said, certainly if you look at the overall landscape is certainly indicating that right now is a perfect time for the UAW to be striking.
Well, Dr. Greiner, we'll definitely keep discussing this with you as more developments come in over time. Is this going to be something on the eyes of a lot of people in Oakland County and throughout the state of Michigan over the next 7 weeks during this negotiating period? Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me, and have a great rest of your week.